Our planet is a never-ending wonder. 1,000,000 years would barely suffice to see all the sights nature has curated, and it would take another billion to truly comprehend their machinations and ecosystems. So, in our human shackles, we can but watch and try to use our time to admire these gardens of life while we can. Today, we will look at one of the most active corners of our globe. The New World, the expanse only recently discovered through the efforts of the Hunters Guild. This massive continent and its surrounding islands have been the subject of much guild and research activity, and presents a perfect place to experience the splendor of our world. This is in no small part due to the staggering diversity of the wildlife. From endemic unicorns to familiar faces, the New World is home to over 70 large monsters, all with their own place in the ecosystem. In this documentary film, we will pay each of them a visit, discovering the miraculous and fascinating ways in which they live in this biological paradise. While every single one of them could, and probably will, fill their very own documentary episode, this film will serve as an extensive overview of all the wonders the New World has to offer. The climate of the New World is distinguished by its hyper-localized biome zones, the arrangement of which is dictated both by air currents and by the Everstream, an underground network that allows bioenergy to flow between all habitats on the continent. The various differing concentrations of this life-giving energy dictate the specific environments that spring up on the continent. In the south, while the western side is covered by the thick and lush ancient forest, the east is home to a much rougher environment. The Wildspire Waste stretches throughout the southeastern corner, a vast and dry desert land that sees much sun and little rain. This arid tundra may at a glance seem devoid of life and variety, but a closer look reveals a surprising density of flora and fauna. Equally surprising is the variety of biomes within the waste. One would expect a dry desert to be little more than sand and dust, and yet in the Wildspire Waste, that is only a fraction of what can be found. While there indeed is a dry, rocky desert area that stretches throughout most of the zone, it isn't homogeneous. The cliff faces in the west are rocky and elevated, while the sand dunes in the center are smooth and flat. But beyond this, the Wildspire Waste also includes the Silent Forest, a lush, green area to the west, nurtured by the vestiges of the bordering ancient forest. From there flows the Wildspire Stream, leftover water from the ancient tree which cuts through the waste, forming a natural boundary between areas and ending in the easternmost corner of the waste, the mudflats, where the dust of the desert and the humid forest offerings mix into a muddy swamp that fans out into the eastern coast. Below this varied surface lies an equally vibrant underground network, a system of caves and tunnels that many monsters use to nest and travel. It is even home to some local Grimalkine tribes. But perhaps the single most significant landmark in the waste are the eponymous Wildspires, giant crags of rock and dried mud that rise up dozens of meters into the sky. These imposing structures are actually created by one of its smallest inhabitants, the carrier ants. Invigorated by the flow of bioenergy, these ant colonies create massive mounds, the largest of which the Commission calls Wildspires. Indeed, while it may seem like a dry dust bowl, the Wildspire Waste is full of surprises. Such a surprising environment thus naturally houses surprising tenants, as the unique assortment of challenges and microbiomes creates a need for creative problem solving. With how rare both shadow and water is, the Wildspire Waste quickly becomes a stage for territorial theatrics, as each species tries to secure their safety from the blazing sun. And one competitor has adapted to this struggle so well that it has become its core way of life. By all standards, the Barroth is an oddly shaped creature. While its theropodal stature and bulky muscle mass are very typical of brute wyverns like itself, the cranial megastructure and thick brown armor plating certainly is not. That structure is called a crown, and it is actually the Barroth's nose, with the vents on top of it functioning as its nostrils. This bizarre adaptation has one specific purpose: to allow the Barroth to remain submerged in mud for as long as easily as possible. The Barroth, while exclusively living in hot climates, actually rather dislikes heat, and thus prefers either covering itself in mud or simply sitting in the cool mud whenever possible. It also does this for feeding purposes. Barroths exclusively eat insects and bugs, most of which congregate in the fertile mudflats of the waste to nest and mate. So thanks to its crown, the Barroth can uninterruptedly snack on bugs and stay cool without much effort. Due to the bony and cumbersome nature of the crown, nearly no predators actually bother with hunting Barroth, as the effort of feeding on this tough and oddly shaped wyvern would outweigh the nutritional gain from its tough, bug-laden meat. Additionally, the Barroth also doesn't have to worry about feeding competition, as it is the only actual bug-eater in the waste. But this begs a question. Why does an animal that must fight neither prey nor predator need full body armor plating? The answer lies in its habitat. Mudflats are a luxury in the Wildspire Waste, and a rare one at that, as the heat reduces most of the area to sand and dust. Thus, every mudhole is a precious treasure to be protected for any species that benefits from them, and that counts doubly for the Barroth. While it could survive outside the mud, as it traverses the plains occasionally both in the New and Old World, the Barroth much prefers the safety and coolness of the mud, and thus it will fight viciously for it. And thanks to its strong plated armor, it is all but immune to cuts and slashes, only giving in to the most severe blunt force trauma. Using this armor, the Barroth defends its territory against everything and anything it perceives as a threat. Not even the occasional Anjanath or Rathian is safe, as the Barroth accepts no unwanted visitors. One such visitor is almost destined to clash with the Barroth, as it is even more desperate for the mudflats. While the Barroth can very easily traverse the rest of the waste when necessary, the Juratodus is a Piscine wyvern and must thus remain within a liquid medium at almost all times. While it does have legs it can walk on, the Juratodus' scales are incredibly sensitive to heat and decay quickly when dry. Due to this, the Juratodus will try to avoid land time as much as possible, which puts it in direct opposition to the Barroth. The two species are often seen clashing in turf wars over specific mudholes. Its slippery body and bone-crushing teeth make the Juratodus a worthy adversary, as it is well suited to dragging large monsters into a watery grave due to that being its main hunting style. Its slippery body allows for tricky maneuvers, and through the use of its many fins, it can adjust its movement to a very fine degree. Those same fins are however also interesting for their historical relevance. While it seems that the Juratodus is endemic to the New World only, it only appears there, the Research Commission's findings suggest that it is actually a very ancient species. Analysis of its body and traits have revealed that the Juratodus might very well be one of the original Piscine wyvern species, from which all other Piscine wyverns evolved from. This is given credence by the large number of fins, which match the number on fins found on old Piscine fossils. This has put a fascinating spin on evolutionary history. Is what the Guild calls the New World actually the original cradle of monster evolution? Either way, the wonders around the discovery of the Juratodus don't end there, as while it is a primitive species, its life cycle was found to include something no other Piscine wyvern engages in: parasitic behavior. During the extremely rare wet seasons in the waste, the Juratodus will mate and produce a cluster of a few dozen eggs, most of which will never hatch due to drying out too quickly. The few that do make it hatch as tiny, almost unrecognizable Protojura, which instinctively seek out large monsters like Apsaros. Once they find them, they use any opening, from wounds to nostrils, to enter the monster's body and begin eating it from the inside until the Juratodas are big enough to survive on their own. There are only a few large organisms that practice parasitism, making the Juratodas quite the exception. Once fully grown, a Juratodas is capable of not just devastating bite attacks, but also of ingesting the mud around it and mixing it with the fluid the monster produces in its water sac, creating a viscous slime that can trap prey. The ability to immobilize or otherwise impede opponents becomes quite crucial in an area so wrought with competition. And when it comes to immobilizing the enemy, few are as adept at it as this next inhabitant of the waste. Nesting in the silent forest, the nightshade Paulomu patrols the skies around its territory diligently. This Paulomu subspecies split off from the main species when it migrated to the Wildspire waste, and thus adapted to a much harsher and more competitive life. While the main Paulomu lazily grazes on the eggs of the coral highlands, the nightshade must contend for meat in the waste, preying on anything it can overpower. This more persistent pressure has made the nightshade significantly more aggressive and more powerful than the normal species. This change is also reflected in the appearance. While the coral Paulomu's fur is pinkish-white to blend in among the corals and abalones, avoiding conflict, the nightshade's plumage is jet black, with green accents and two big red dots on its neck, a coloration that clearly sends a message. Do not mess with me. This effect is only increased by the Paulomu family's signature ability, an inflatable neck sac that they can fill with air by breathing it in. When inflated, the nightshade's markings become much more apparent and warn the enemy that they should retreat, or face the consequences. Should the opponent not heed the warning, or should the nightshade deem them weak enough to prey upon, it will use its ace, a powerful narcotic gas that it can generate in its neck pouch and launch at shocking velocity. One whiff will put almost anything to sleep, never to wake again. The clouds of gas the nightshade produces are quite longevous, and the beast can even move them around by manipulating wind currents with its wings and tail. Additionally, it retains all of the aerial mobility of the regular Paulomu, using the inflated pouch to hover and float in midair and the wings to make rapid adjustments. With the absence of a strong Wrath population in the waste, as Rathians only rarely nest in the silent forest, the nightshade Paulomu is free to reign over the skies above the sands. Reign over the sands themselves, however, is much more contested. While the Baroth and Juratodos live out their rivalry over the mudflats, and the nightshade Paulomu bullies any lost Rathians in the silent forest, none of them have the reach or the power to be an apex species of the waste. That position is fought over in a constant deadlock with no clear winner. One species invested in this competition is one of the first monsters the guild ever catalogued, the twin-horned terror of the desert, the mighty Diablos. An enormous flying wyvern, this monster is adorned with rock-hard armor, an imposing neck frill, and its famous two horns, giant impalers that leave even the toughest opponents running for the hills. While called a flying wyvern, the Diablos actually avoids flying if possible. Its heavy armor makes aerial movement clumsy and unwieldy, and the bulkier New World population of Diablos has never been sighted flying at all, while Old World Diablos have been observed in the air on very rare occasions. Instead, the strong blunt claws at the end of its arms allow it to move through the ground through digging, allowing for swift movement across the sandy plains. Despite its fierce appearance, however, the Diablos are completely herbivoreal, feeding exclusively on cacti. This does not make them docile, however, as cactus clusters big enough to sustain such a large creature reliably are not common. So the ones the Diablos does find are fiercely protected, making them brutally territorial. Besides the obvious danger of the charging horns, the Diablos can also attack using its large club-like tail. And while it doesn't possess any ranged abilities per se, Its roar is so powerful that it can annihilate the eardrums of any that get too close, leaving them dazed and open for more violence. This aggression is directed against any trespassers and disturbances, but also at other Diablos, be it over territory or mating rights. But even if one male Diablos wins against another in a contest for mating privileges, there is one more challenge he must brave: the Black Diablos. The Black Diablos is a fascinating beast, not just for its ecology, but for its place in the history of the guild itself. Just like the regular Diablos, the Black Diablos was discovered early on in the efforts of the guild to catalog the monster fauna. As it was a rarely seen, obviously different Diablos, guild researchers at the time believed it to be a subspecies, a genetically different race of Diablos that split off from the main species on a DNA level. This assumption became widespread throughout the guild writings and even entered the public well of knowledge. However, as more Black Diablos were observed and as research continued, it became clear that this was a mistake. A Black Diablos is simply a female Diablos in heat, which puts it into the category of variants. While subspecies are genetically distinct populations, variants are individual monsters that undergo changes within their lifetime due to various non-genetic factors. In simplest terms, subspecies are born the way they are, variants become the way they are within their lifetime. However, the misconception about the Black Diablos being a subspecies was already so widespread that to this day it finds its way into official records, despite having been proven false. A Black Diablos is born as a regular female Diablos, which then receives a deep black pigmentation when she enters mating season. This pigmentation works twofold. On one hand, it lets male Diablos know that she is ready to mate, but it also signals that she is dangerous and deadly to anyone who approaches her, the male Diablos included. A Black Diablos will only allow the strongest male to mate with her, and will regularly attack and even kill weaker suitors, a tendency empowered by the fact that female Diablos are naturally bigger than males. Black Diablos are more vicious and violent than the regular kind, but luckily this sort of violence only occurs during mating seasons. Nonetheless, this constant power struggle makes the herbivoreal Diablos a menacing threat to even the largest carnivores, and gives it a spot of contender for rule over the waste. However, the Diablos does not go unopposed. While almost no monster can match its brute brawn, there is one that can even the playing field through tenacity and brains. The scraping metallic sounds followed by bellowing roars is the unmistakable mark of the Glavenus, a dark red species of brute wyvern. Any onlooker will immediately notice its most striking feature. The long, blade-like tail is a bizarre and fearsome adaptation that sets the Glavenus apart from almost any other monster. While it does serve as a balancing tool for the heavy beast, the carnivorous Glavenus uses it primarily for combat, being able to easily cut its prey in half. The tail is formed through the accumulation of metallic ores and minerals on the tip of its tail, which are then scraped against rocks and other hard surfaces throughout the Glavenus' life to form a permanent cutting edge. However, this raw power is made beyond deadly when combined with the Glavenus' intelligence, as despite the name, this brute wyvern is anything but dull. When engaging an opponent, the Glavenus will continuously swipe and scrape its tail not just for attacking, but specifically to use the friction as a way to heat up its blade, until it turns into a red-hot cleaver, able to burn and cut through almost any adversary. In this state, its destructive power is immense, but again, the true danger comes from the beast's brains. By scraping the flaming tail even further along the ground, the Glavenus can create flames which it can even then swipe towards enemies with its tail. However, this red-hot state has a drawback. Since the blade is made from metals, the heat warps and melts them as well, causing the edge to lose shape and become dull. While it could reshape the tail into a blade over time, same as it did as a juvenile, that would be a slow process, unsuitable for the midst of combat. and a dull blade in the middle of the action spells doom for a Glavenus. Or it would, were it not for the monster's most incredible ability. On the Glavenus' jaws sit 4 specialized fangs, much larger and harder than its other teeth, made from the most durable parts of its shell. These fangs are not for biting or even for eating. Their use only begins once the tail dulls. When that happens, the Glavenus will twist around to place its tail edge into its mouth and then scrape it alongside. The 4 fangs will then serve as an emergency sharpening tool, as they grind across the tail and shape it back into a razor-sharp blade. The size of the fangs also protects the Glavenus' eyes from any sparks the sharpening might produce. However, the vast utility of this maneuver doesn't end there. The metallic material the fangs scrape off is then swallowed by the Glavenus and stored in a specialized throat organ called the bursa, which uses body heat to essentially function like a furnace. In the bursa, the metals and ores are melted down into pure magma, which the Glavenus can then spit out at enemies. When enraged, this process can become so powerful that it temporarily discolors the shell to a more vibrant red. However, among this impressive arsenal, the Glavenus' greatest weapon remains its wits and understanding of its situation. While these weapons are indeed fearsome, the Glavenus doesn't possess the brute force necessary to face enemies like a Diablos, as it relies almost entirely on its tail attacks, which require space, precision, and luck. But through its intelligence, it realizes that the threat of a flaming hot knife and an infernal furnace are more than enough to avoid many fights altogether. Thus, it will often face other monsters with its mouth wide agape, revealing the red-hot bursa, while the tail scrapes loudly behind it. This threat display alone cements the Glavenus as a top dog, as only very few monsters are brazen enough to engage after seeing something like that. However, monsters that brazen do exist. While some beasts weigh their actions carefully, calculating their exact chances of victory, some others enter every encounter roaring and screaming for blood. This is the case for the flying menace of the New World, the Basilgoose. This enormous flying wyvern can often be seen entering the Wildspire Waste to feed and to fight. At an average length of 19 meters, it far exceeds the normally slender and small frames of most flying wyverns, its massive cone-shaped body being carried through the winds by gigantic wings and balanced by a long bulbous tail. Its massive body doesn't, however, limit its ability to fly, which is very odd. Most flying creatures evolve to either be small and light or have hollow bone structures and fast digestive systems as to keep the body as lightweight as possible. None of this seems to be the case for Basilgeuse, which implies that it stays in the sky purely by the potentially enormous muscle strength and buoyancy of its wings. And unlike other flying wyverns, it barely flaps its wings as it soars through the sky, making it less likely for prey to hear it coming. However, besides its size, the Basilgeuse distinguishes itself through the many oval growths on its underside, which many guild hunters refer to as scales. This is a misnomer though, as they are actually chunks of an explosive liquid that Basilgeuse secretes, which hardens when in contact with air. When it first leaves the beast's body, it enters a solid state, hardening and taking up the infamous scale-like shape. It then hangs off the beast's body until it is willingly detached, at which point it lands on the ground and sits dormant for a short while. Once enough time passes or the scales are subjected to physical force, they violently explode into a small flame. These bombs comprise the Basilgeuse's most powerful ability, which it can boost further by superheating the production of the explosive liquid, causing it to glow with heat. It is no wonder then that the Basilgeuse is quite successful in its disruptions. Anytime it enters the waste, mayhem ensues, as it can rival both the Diablos and the Glavenus. Some researchers have even theorized that the only reason the Basilgeuse doesn't dominate the waste permanently is its nomadic nature. It leaves before it can establish itself. Were a Basilgeuse to nest permanently in the waste, it would likely reign supreme. But alas, findings about ecological dominance are often made irrelevant as soon as elder dragons enter the picture. These devastating behemoths stand above the natural order and are many magnitudes more oppressive than even the strongest regular monster. In the old world, elder dragons were almost always a threat, a disturbance. However, due to the elder crossing phenomenon, wherein dozens of elder dragons regularly migrate to the new world, the new continent's ecosystem have acclimated to the presence of these beasts, and the Wildspire Waste is no exception. The resident elder dragons are the flaming duo of legend, Teostra and Lunastra. Even among elder dragons, these two are special for many reasons. For one, they are the only dragons with distinct genders and accompanying sexual dimorphism. The red Teostra is male, while the blue Lunastra is female. Adjacently, they are also the only known elder dragons to cooperate, cohabit, and even mate with each other. So while they may be elder dragons, they seem quite close to a more normal species. This normalcy vanishes, however, once one observes their abilities and lifestyle. The Teostra and Lunastra are neither carnivores nor herbivores, since neither of them have ever been observed eating meat or plants. Instead, they consume minerals and ores, scraping them out of their rocky walls. How exactly they extract nourishment from this diet is still unknown, as is much about elder dragons in general. However, this habit does fuel their terrifying abilities. The fire dragons use their mineral diet to produce various substances with their scales. The Teostra grinds and mixes them into a fine dust that it can both actively and passively release from its scales and fur. This dust is highly flammable and will explode the moment it comes into contact with heat. This process isn't up to luck, however, as the Teostra has specially developed front teeth that, when snapped against each other, reliably create a spark which ignites the dust and detonates all of it almost instantly. The Lunastra, meanwhile, produces an oily liquid from the minerals which doesn't explode, but instead produces extremely longevous blue flames that burn for an extended period of time and scatter deadly heat all around themselves. Beyond these unique substances, both dragons use the minerals to produce flames within their body that can spew in enormous streams from their mouths. Their body temperature can in fact rise up so high due to this process that just being near them can prove fatal. They rarely emerge out into the waste, but when they do, the air is loaded with explosive dust and deadly heat all over, causing almost all other inhabitants to hide and flee. The more aggressive Teostra scouts the area, while the more laid-back Lunastra lazes about. Their partnership is still mysterious to the guild, but they do seem to engage in courtship behavior. Teostras have been observed showing a Lunastra a freshly built nest of molten rock and glass. Their bond goes so far that they can even combine forces, with both of them scattering their flaming substances in a wide area and detonating it all at once. The Wildspire Waste is a rough patch of land, wrought with endless competition over its scarce resources. From the unassuming Baroth to the uncontested duo of fire dragons, all who live here face a daily struggle they overcome only through force, wits, and tenacity. But that is not necessarily hardship. This is just one way within which nature controls itself and creates the marvelous sights that we wonder at in films like these. And it is these pressures that create some of the most fascinating and awe-inspiring behavior nature has to offer.